Today, we're diving into a really powerful framework for looking at the news, and it comes from the classic book Manufacturing Consent. Let's get into it.
So, have you ever stopped and wondered about this? You scroll through your phone and some story is just everywhere. It's all anyone's talking about. But then other events, things that seem just as important or maybe even more so, they just disappear. It's a question that really makes you think about how we get our information about the world.
Okay, to see what we're talking about, check out this example from the book. It's pretty stark. Back in the 80s, a single priest was tragically murdered in communist Poland. The New York Times ran 78 articles on it, 10 of them on the front page. Massive coverage. But during that same time, over 100 religious figures were murdered in Latin American countries that were allied with the US. And the number of articles in the Times? Zero. Not a single one. It's the same kind of tragedy, but the response couldn't be more different. So what is the deal here? Well, the authors of the book, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, they came up with a way to explain this. They call it the propaganda model. And right away, it's important to know this isn't some conspiracy theory. It's a way of looking at the media as a system, one that has these biases just built right into its structure.
And this is such a crucial point they make. The model isn't about some secret group of people in a back room deciding what you see. No, they argue it's more of a free market outcome. The biases we see are just the natural result of how the whole industry is set up, the economics and the institutions behind it. So the censorship they're talking about, it's largely self-censorship.
So how does it actually work? Well, the model suggests that all the raw information out there, everything that happens in the world, has to pass through a series of filters before it ever gets to us. And what comes out on the other side is the news we read, see, and hear, already shaped and selected by this process.
And that brings us to the very heart of the model. What the authors argue are the 5 filters that process our news.
So, first up is the ownership filter. This is the simple fact that the major media outlets we rely on are huge, for-profit corporations. And they're not just any corporations. They're often owned by even bigger corporate giants.
And the scale of this is just, wow. This data is from when the book was written, and it shows the incredible wealth of the families who controlled these media companies. I mean, we're talking billions, even back then. The model's argument here is pretty straightforward. A media company, owned by a billionaire, is probably not going to be too eager to publish stories that seriously threaten the interests of billionaires.
All right, the second filter is advertising. Here's the thing. For most big media companies, you, the reader or viewer, aren't the real customer. The advertisers are. The media outlet is selling a product, and that product is you, the audience. This gives advertisers what the authors call a de facto licensing authority. Basically, they get a vote on what content gets made. And this story just perfectly illustrates the point. There was this British newspaper, the Daily Herald, and it was hugely popular with working-class readers. I mean, it had almost double the readers of the Times, the Financial Times, and the Guardian put together. But it failed. It went out of business. Why? Because advertisers wanted to reach the richer, more affluent audiences of those other papers, even though they're way smaller. The paper just couldn't survive without that advertising money, no matter how many people loved reading it.
Okay, next up is the sourcing filter. Think about it. A news organization is a machine that needs a constant, steady supply of raw material, news. So where do they get it reliably? They station journalists at the places where news is always being made: the White House, the Pentagon, corporate headquarters. This makes those official sources the default starting point for so much of what we hear.
And this dependency creates a really interesting dynamic. According to a study cited in the book, there are over 20,000 more public relations agents working to manage and spin the news than there are journalists trying to report it. Just think about that imbalance for a second. That's a key part of this filter.
Filter number 4 is a great word, flack. Flack is just organized negative blowback. If a story steps out of line or questions a powerful interest, that media outlet can expect an absolute storm of criticism, complaints, threatened lawsuits, pressure campaigns, the whole 9 yards.
And we're not just talking about a couple of angry phone calls. The book points to these incredibly well-funded organizations that were basically created just to monitor the media and dish out flack whenever they felt it was needed. They're there to discipline any outlets that stray too far, and over time, that has a real chilling effect.
And the fifth and final filter is a big picture one: ideology. To get a whole population on the same page, the thinking goes, you need a common enemy or a national crusade. For decades, the authors argue, that ideology was anti-communism. Anything could be justified if it was in the service of fighting communism.
They suggest that today, that ideology might be a deep belief in the miracle of the market. It's the thing that sets the boundaries of what's considered a reasonable opinion.
So, that's the theory of the 5 filters. Pretty interesting, right? But now, let's see how the model predicts this all plays out in the real world, with a really powerful case study from the book. So, okay, how does all this filtering business actually translate into the articles and reports we see?
Well, the model makes a really specific and testable prediction here. It says that the media will essentially divide victims of violence into 2 classes, worthy and unworthy. If people are harmed by an official enemy state, their stories will be told with detail and emotion. They're worthy of our sympathy and outrage. But if people are harmed by our own government or one of its allies, their stories will be downplayed or just ignored. They are unworthy.
The data on this is pretty eye-opening. Just look at how the word genocide, one of the most powerful words we have, was used in the 1990s. For official enemies like Serbia and Iraq, it was used hundreds of times. But for atrocities committed by allies, like Indonesia in East Timor or Turkey against the Kurds, the term was used way, way less, even when the violence was on a comparable massive scale. The difference is just incredible.
And the author's conclusion from this is so direct. They say this pattern is so reliable that you can basically figure out who America's friends and enemies are just by looking at the words the media uses to describe them.
So we've walked through the 5 filters and a pretty intense case study. The big question now is, what do we do with all this? How can this be useful to us?
Well, the authors are clear that this isn't meant to be the absolute final truth about how the media works. Instead, it's a lens. It's a tool that we can use to ask better questions about the news we consume. Who owns this outlet? Who's paying for the ads? Where did they get this information from? Is there any flack being generated around this story? And what's the big picture ideology framing it all?
And that really brings us to the final thought here. This model was created in a totally different era, before the internet really took off, before social media, before this 24/7 news world we live in now. So the big question for all of us is, do these filters still hold up? Have they just changed form? Or are there totally new filters we need to be aware of in our modern digital world? That's definitely something to think about.